Mr. Robeson, you played Othello in the 30s and then again in 1944, wasn't it? And has your interpretation of the part changed since then?
Well, we'll probably be discussing that as we go along. I would like to certainly say now that it's sort of the culmination of a dream of my life to have the opportunity of playing at Stratford, and certainly want to express my deep thanks to the company there. I remember 1930 being very frightened, my first attempt at Shakespeare. Spent a lot of time trying to learn how to speak English. But remember, the cast, Dame Sybil Thorndike played Amelia, Dame Peggy Ashcroft played Desdemona, Sir Ralph Richardson played Roderigo, and an old friend, Alistair Sim, played the clowns.
Performance.
And the 1944 performance was produced by Margaret Webster, the daughter of Dame May Whitty and Ben Webster. And looking and hearing the distinguished architect, Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright, I remember that we played Othello in 1944 in Madison, Wisconsin. It was my pleasure to visit Taliesin, and glad to know also that he comes from Wales, my beloved Wales. I would say that the interpretations were somewhat different in each performance. The 1944, especially stressing the poetry, taking off and booming it out. And this one has been a very interesting experience.
Well, does the audience play any part in your interpretation?
The audience plays a very important one, I would say already. Not quite so difficult after the first night, with just the people wandering in who like Shakespeare. And looking forward to all the audiences this summer and winter. Most important to the audience to my mind, is what I feel Shakespeare meant, because I feel that Othello was a black man in a white society, and that the feelings of Brabantio, the father, the sort of the underlying hatred of this man when it came too close, is very important. I had an experience in 1944 of playing in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is just on the border of the South. And from Louisville, Kentucky, across the river, quite a few people came over. And for about half the performance, nobody knew what was going to happen. Everything was very tense. And I was very careful how close I got to Desdemona, for example. I didn't get too close there. And there was real tension. Let's presume, for example, that we could get on the stage and get out of Johannesburg. You know, this would be... Now, somewhere, I think Shakespeare meant this. An audience that would feel it that tensely.
I see. Well, now, this is not the usual interpretation of Othello. It's usually interpreted much more as a play about sexual jealousy. Now, are you influenced by any critic in this interpretation?
Oh, profoundly. In 1930, I took up the variorum of Shakespeare, and it led me to Bradley, whom I feel is closest to this point of view. And this has been established also and commented upon by Dr. Dover Wilson in the Cambridge edition of Shakespeare, in which he accepts very, very much this point of view. And I feel that this bears a good deal on the credibility of the jealousy, that Othello comes from a different culture. For example, suppose an English lad married, say, a girl from Malaya, and the Malayan Iago started on him. Well, he might not quite know what to do. This is very important, I feel, in the development.
The bewilderment is, in fact, a matter of him being a stranger in the society.
That's one of the things that would bear on the jealousy.
But you're not trying to push the jealousy out of the window, are you?
Obviously, you can't put... But this is an extremely important point, too. As Othello says, that he kills not in hate, but in honor. And he says to Iago, you know, I didn't see it, I didn't think it, you know. I slept the next night well. I found not Cassio's kisses on her lips, you understand? And if I had not known it, it had been quite some other thing. But, so it wasn't just the act of infidelity. It was the destruction of himself as a human being, of his human dignity. And may I add, in thinking of the part myself, that I related that dignity not to myself personally, say, in a modern society, but to my whole people. Modestly, I've struggled for the rights of my folk, and I have accepted many personal insults. But when the insult becomes an insult to my people as a whole, then there's danger. I was once playing football, and my nose was broken. Well, I was quite willing to take that, but I suddenly realized that these fellows were saying that you are Negro, you are frightened of us, you are frightened of a white man, you run. And when I thought of that, the next play, I had a fellow about 165 over my head, and I was about to break his back. I guess it would have been the end of his life. Somebody yelled, all right. But this was an insult to my people, not to me. And this, I feel, is very important in Othello's defense of what he calls his honor and his dignity.
So what you're trying to do really is to make it a more complex play than simply the interpretation of jealousy makes.
No, I'm not trying to make it. I think Shakespeare
made it. I understand.
I
Yes.
wouldn't dare do that.
But would you say this is in fact an older man's interpretation, that a younger man, that maybe you in the 30s, interpreted much more in terms of physical passion?
No, I came to this decision in the 30s as well.
I see.
That this was a play essentially of honor. And certainly one is jealous, but one might not kill for that reason. Othello represented a whole culture to my mind.
What about the modern critics, people like Wilson Knight, who've interpreted the play primarily as a poem rather than as a character study?
Well, I would say it's all right to interpret it as a poem, but it would be doing violence again to Shakespeare, one of the great dramatists of all time. The very essence is character. There's no reason why the poetry shouldn't reflect the character. For example, Othello, coming from an Eastern culture, is more ornate. As an African, one of Africa, you ever heard some of the great African orators? And my father was in that tradition. Every Sunday morning, it would be a rolling out of a great sermon, and now we bow down on bended knee, O Lord. And it became like an opera almost. And so some of the speeches of Othello, you know, arise, black vengeance, from thy hollow cell, yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyranny, swell. Well, yes, it could be done, but Mr. Richardson said, now, Paul, now, wait a minute now, just get some truth here. Don't quite roll it out so much.
Well, on the question of Mr. Richardson's production, I'm not so sure. That I felt that he cut the play down so much that he tried to turn it into prose, and that, in a sense, this was cramping you. You were only firing
No,
on
I would
6 or 8
disagree. What he
scenes.
said, Mr. Richardson, is that Mr. Shakespeare's words are there. I'm saying them. And they speak more or less for themselves. They don't need to be pushed along too much. Soft you a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service, and they know it. Just say it. Mr. Shakespeare knows what's going to happen. You don't have to roll it out too much. That was his point of view, because he was seeking for truth in terms of the contemporary audience.